The Grand Horizon Hotel ballroom glittered like a submerged treasure chest, all crystal chandeliers and cascading white orchids that cost more than most people's yearly rent. Ava Sterling stood at the center of it all, her spine so straight it looked painful, her smile so fixed it could have been carved from marble. She was 22, heiress to the Sterling Empire, and the most photographed woman in the room. Her champagne flute remained untouched. She had learned, at the tender age of 7, that drinking anything in public meant giving your enemies ammunition. Her mother had taught her that, right before she'd walked out the door and never came back. Tonight was her father's 60th birthday. The guest list was a who's who of global finance, old money, and the new tech billionaires who pretended they didn't care about old money, but secretly desperately wanted its approval. Ava had spent 3 hours being air-kissed by women who hated her and shaking hands with men who had tried to acquire her father's company at least twice. She was exhausted down to her bones, but she showed none of it. She was, after all, a Sterling. Across the ballroom, a man was mopping the floor. He was tall, which was unusual for a janitor, and broad-shouldered, which was even more unusual. His gray coveralls were pristine, his boots freshly polished. He moved with a quiet efficiency that somehow drew the eye despite his obvious determination to remain invisible. His name was Elias Vance, and he had been working at the Grand Horizon for exactly 3 weeks. Before that, he had been living in his car. Before that, he had been the CEO of Vance Technologies, a Fortune 500 company that had collapsed in a spectacular blaze of fraud and betrayal engineered by his own board of directors. His best friend had been the mastermind. His fiancée had been the accomplice. They had left him with nothing but a ruined reputation, a mountain of debt he hadn't known existed, and a single box of his mother's belongings. The janitor job was humiliating. It was also the only thing he could get. His identity was legally sealed under a protective court order, the same court that had cleared him of all criminal charges, but couldn't restore his name fast enough. So he pushed his mop and kept his head down and watched the world he used to rule from the most invisible vantage point possible. Ava saw him. She saw everyone in a room. It was a survival instinct, honed over years of navigating corporate sharks. The janitor caught her attention because he didn't look at her. That, in itself, was unprecedented. Men always looked at her, whether she wanted them to or not. It was the curse of being both a Sterling and objectively beautiful. But this janitor swept his eyes across the room with the practiced disinterest of someone who had seen far too much glamour to be impressed. She felt a tiny prickle of irritation, followed immediately by shame. She was judging a man for doing his job. She had become her mother. She looked away, her jaw tightening. Her father, Victor Sterling, was holding court near the grand piano. He was a lion in a tuxedo, silver-haired, and still handsome at 60. He'd built an empire from nothing, a fact he reminded everyone of constantly. He was also dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. He had 3 months, maybe 4. Ava was the only one who knew. Her father had called her into his study 2 weeks ago, his face ashen and his hands trembling for the first time in her memory. "It's yours," he'd said, sliding a velvet box across the mahogany desk. Inside was the Sterling family seal, a heavy gold signet ring engraved with a phoenix rising from flames. "You inherit it all. The company, the debt, the enemies, the legacy." She had taken the ring and said nothing. What was there to say? She had been training for this her entire life. The only thing she hadn't anticipated was the loneliness of it. Tonight, her uncle Marcus, her father's younger brother and a perennial schemer, was circling like a vulture. He had spent his life in his older brother's shadow, and he had never quite forgiven him for being more brilliant. Now he saw his chance. "Ava, darling," he said, appearing at her elbow with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "You must be exhausted. Let an old man get you a drink." He was 58, spry, and dangerous. She had seen his financial records. He was in debt to the wrong people, desperate enough to do something stupid. "I'm fine, Uncle Marcus," she said, her voice ice. "Perhaps you should sit down. You look pale." The insult was subtle, layered. He was the one who looked like he might collapse from stress, not her. Marcus's smile flickered, just barely. Always the sharp tongue. Just like your mother. It was a low blow, a deliberate one. Ava felt her composure crack, just for a moment. Her mother had left, had abandoned them. Marcus knew it was her deepest wound. My mother, Ava said, her voice dropping to a whisper, is not here. And neither, soon, will you be, if you keep speaking to me that way. She turned away before he could respond, her heart racing. She hated confrontation. It reminded her too much of the fights she'd heard between her parents as a child, the screaming, the shattering glass. But she had learned to fight. Elias, pushing his mop toward the service corridor, had overheard the exchange. He couldn't help it. His hearing had always been acute, a leftover from years of high-stakes negotiation. He saw the way the girl's shoulders tensed, the slight tremor in her hand as she set down her champagne flute. She was young, too young for the weight she was carrying. He recognized the load. He'd carried it himself once. His chest tightened with an unwanted sympathy. Then he saw Marcus Sterling's face as the man watched his niece walk away. It wasn't just resentment. It was calculation. Cold, measured, murderous calculation. Elias had seen that look before, on the face of his former best friend the day before he'd sold him out. Something was coming. Something bad. The evening wore on. Ava made her rounds, smiled at the right people, made the right promises. By 11, she was running on fumes. She escaped to the balcony, her favorite hiding spot since childhood. The night air was cool, the city lights sprawling below her like a fallen constellation. She took a deep breath, the first real breath she'd taken all night. Then she heard footsteps. She tensed, expecting her uncle or another sycophant, but it was the janitor. He was carrying a tray, of all things, with a single cup of tea. The kitchen was about to throw out the kettle, he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel smoothed by water. Thought you might want something warm. You looked cold. She blinked at him, completely thrown. No one brought her tea. No one noticed if she was cold. She was Ava Sterling, the ice princess. I'm not cold, she said automatically. He shrugged, setting the cup on the balcony railing anyway. Suit yourself. But the water's still hot. He turned to leave, and something in her chest cracked. The loneliness. The sheer, overwhelming loneliness. Wait, she said. He paused. Why did you do that? She asked. I'm nobody to you. He didn't turn around. I know what it's like, he said quietly, to be surrounded by people and still feel alone. He walked back inside, leaving her on the balcony with a steaming cup of tea and the strangest sense that she had just met someone who understood her more than anyone in that ballroom full of wealthy strangers. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his face beyond a vague impression of sharp cheekbones and tired eyes. But she remembered the way he'd said those words, as if he'd tasted the same bitterness she had. She drank the tea. It was perfect. Exactly the way she liked it, with honey and a splash of lemon. No one had ever brought her tea like that. She had never told anyone how she took it. The realization made her heart beat faster. Later, when the last guest had left and the ballroom was being dismantled, Ava asked the head of housekeeping about the tall janitor. Elias, the woman said, raising an eyebrow. Nice enough fellow. Keeps to himself. Why do you ask, Miss Sterling? Ava shrugged, feigning indifference. No reason. Just curious. She went back to her penthouse suite and lay awake in her silk sheets, replaying the moment on the balcony. The tea. The words. The way he'd looked at her. Not with lust or greed or ambition, but with something she couldn't quite name. Recognition. That was it. He had recognized something in her. She stared at the ceiling and let herself dream, just for a moment, of a life where she wasn't the heir to a crumbling empire, where she was just a girl who drank tea on a balcony with a janitor. Then her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was a single photograph, her father's hospital report. The words Stage 4 pancreatic cancer were highlighted in red. Below it, a message. You have 1 week. Hand over the seal, or everyone will know Daddy is dying. No more heir. No more empire. Just a corpse and a scandal. She dropped the phone, her hand shaking. Her uncle. It had to be Marcus. He knew, and he was threatening her. She sat in the darkness, her chest heaving. The seal, the phoenix ring, was in her nightstand drawer. If she handed it over, Marcus would destroy everything her father had built. If she didn't, he would leak the truth and the stock would plummet, the board would panic, and she would be left fighting a war on two fronts. She had no army. She had no allies. She had only herself. Except maybe that wasn't true. The memory of the janitor's steady gaze filled her mind. He had seen her, truly seen her, and he had offered her something she hadn't known she needed. A moment of peace. A cup of tea. She didn't know what he was or who he had been, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was no ordinary janitor. There was a stillness to him, a depth that spoke of hidden layers and buried secrets. She threw on her robe and rushed down to the service floor. She had to find him. She had to ask him why he had helped her, who he really was, and whether he would help her now. If he refused, she was alone. If he agreed, she might stand a chance. She knocked on the door of the small janitor's quarters, her heart pounding. The door swung open. Elias Vance stood there, still in his coveralls, looking at her with a flicker of surprise. "Miss Sterling," he said. "It's late." She held out the ring, the phoenix seal gleaming in the dim light. "Help me," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. "I don't know you, but I need help. I need someone who can see what's coming. Someone who isn't afraid." He studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, he stepped aside to let her in. "You have no idea what you're asking," he said. She met his gaze, her fear hardening into resolve. "I have no idea what I'm doing at all," she admitted. "But I know I can't do it alone." And in that moment, as the door closed behind her, Ava Sterling understood that she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The Ice Princess had reached out to a janitor. And the janitor, she was about to learn, was a king in hiding. The battle for the Sterling Empire had just taken its first, most unlikely turn. Elias Vance closed the door behind Ava Sterling and watched her stand in the middle of his cramped quarters like a porcelain doll in a coal mine. The room was barely 10 feet square, with a narrow cot, a metal locker, and a small desk cluttered with worn paperbacks and a single-framed photograph of an elderly woman with kind eyes. Ava's silk robe brushed against the concrete floor, and she looked wildly out of place, her platinum hair catching the harsh fluorescent light like spun silver. He had not expected her to come here. He had not expected her to find him. But he had known from the moment he'd set the tea down on that balcony railing that she was not the kind of woman who let things go. She was a Sterling through and through, stubborn, proud, and too intelligent for her own good. "You have 5 minutes," he said, his voice flat. He crossed his arms over his chest, a defensive gesture he'd perfected over the last year. "Then you leave, and you forget you ever saw this room." She flinched, just barely, but she held her ground. "I don't have 5 minutes," she said, holding up her phone with the photograph still glowing on the screen. "My uncle knows about my father's illness. He's threatening to expose it. The board will panic. The stock will collapse. He'll swoop in, buy up the shares at fire sale prices, and take everything my father spent 40 years building." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I don't know who you are, but I know you're not a janitor. I've seen your hands, Mr. Whatever your name is. They're not the hands of a man who's spent years scrubbing floors. There's calluses on your fingers, yes, but they're on the pads, not the palms. That's from typing. And your boots, those are custom-made. I've seen the stitching before. Only one brand makes that pattern, and they don't sell to janitors." She was sharper than he'd given her credit for. He felt a flicker of respect, buried under the layers of caution he'd wrapped around himself. "You're observant," he said. "That's a dangerous trait in your world." She moved closer, her eyes searching his face. "I spent my entire life being underestimated," she said. "I learned to look at the details other people ignore. You saved me from my uncle's assassination attempt. Didn't you? The champagne flute I was about to drink, you knocked it off the table when you passed by. I saw you do it. It was deliberate." He said nothing. He had indeed seen Marcus Sterling slip a small vial into Ava's champagne glass. He'd moved without thinking, just as he'd done 100 times in his past life when a negotiation was about to go sideways. The timing had been perfect, a clumsy stumble, a tray of appetizers, the flute tipping over. The servants had cleaned up the mess. Ava had accepted a fresh glass from a different server. She had been safe. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Liar," she said softly. "You're a terrible liar. Just like my father. His tells are the same as yours, the way you look slightly to the left when you're fabricating. The way your voice drops half an octave." He cursed under his breath. She was too perceptive by half. If she could read him this easily, she'd be a target for every predator in her social circle. "You need to go," he said, more harshly than he intended. "Now." She didn't move. Instead, she set the phoenix ring on his desk, the gold catching the light. "I came here because I don't have anyone else," she said. "My father is dying. My uncle is trying to destroy me. My mother left when I was 7. My so-called friends would sell me out for a fraction of my inheritance. You're the only person in this entire city who saw me as a human being, even for a moment. I don't know your name. I don't know your story, but I know you understand what it's like to lose everything." Her voice cracked on the last word, and he felt something shift in his chest. He knew that tone. It was the same one he'd used when he'd stood in a courtroom, stripped of his company, his reputation, his future, and told the judge he had nothing left to lose. "I can't help you," he said, but the words came out weaker than he'd intended.
"I'm nobody.
I have no power, no money, no connections. I'm a janitor. That's all I am now." She laughed, a bitter, exhausted sound. "You're a janitor who recognized attempted murder in a champagne glass and stopped it without breaking stride. You're a janitor who knew my tea order without being told. You're a janitor with hands that have signed billion-dollar contracts and custom-made boots that cost more than most people's rent. You're not nobody. You're someone who's hiding. And I need someone who knows how to hide, because I need to learn how to do it too." He stared at her. She was brilliant. Terrifyingly brilliant. But she was also young and desperate and completely unprepared for the kind of war she was about to walk into. "Sit down," he said finally, gesturing to the only chair in the room. She sat, her posture perfect despite the exhaustion etched into her features. He sat on the edge of his cot, his elbows resting on his knees. "My name is Elias Vance," he said. "I used to run Vance Technologies. It was a mid-sized firm, but we were growing fast, until my board of directors, led by my best friend, framed me for embezzlement. They took everything. My company, my savings, my reputation. I was exonerated in court, but the damage was done. The media had already crucified me. I lost my fiancé, my home, every single person I thought cared about me. I spent 6 months living in my car. This job is the first thing I've been able to hold down in a year." Ava listened without interrupting. Her face was unreadable, but he saw her hands clench in her lap. "Your best friend," she said quietly. "What happened to him?" "He's still running my company," Elias said, his jaw tightening. "He's richer than ever. He married my ex-fiancée. They live in my old penthouse, drive my old cars, sleep in my old bed. They're untouchable. I've got nothing left to fight them with." "That's not true," Ava said, her voice suddenly fierce. "You have your experience. You have your knowledge. You have the same skills that built that company in the first place. They didn't take those from you." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fire behind her eyes. It was the same fire he'd once had, before the world had crushed it out of him. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "You want me to be your advisor, your bodyguard? I can't fight your uncle." "Ava, I don't have the resources." "No," she said, leaning forward. "I don't want you to fight him. I want you to teach me how to fight my own battles. You know how to read people. You know how to anticipate moves before they happen. You survived complete ruin and rebuilt yourself from nothing. I need to learn how to do that. I need to learn how to be invisible and powerful at the same time." He considered her proposal. It was insane. He was a fugitive from his own life, a man who couldn't even get a credit card without setting off alarms. Taking on the Sterling Empire, even as a shadow advisor, was a guaranteed path to disaster. But she was looking at him with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Unvarnished, desperate, foolish hope. And he remembered what it had felt like to hope before the world had taught him better. "One condition," he said. "You tell no one about this. Not your father, not your friends, not your therapist if you have one. This meeting never happened. We communicate through a burner phone, and we meet in public places where no one knows either of us. If we're ever found out, you deny everything and I disappear. Understood?" She nodded, a flicker of a smile crossing her face. "Understood. And you stop drinking anything your uncle hands you," he added. "You stop eating food he's been anywhere near. You assume everyone in your circle is a potential enemy until proven otherwise. Trust is a luxury you can't afford anymore." "I know," she said. "I've known that for years. I just didn't have the courage to admit it." They spent the next hour going over Marcus Sterling's known associates, his financial entanglements, his weaknesses. Ava had a sharp mind. She remembered every detail, every slight, every rumor she'd ever heard. Elias found himself impressed despite his reservations. She was a natural strategist, but she lacked the ruthlessness that survival required. He would have to teach her that. He would have to teach her how to become a knife in the dark instead of a shield in the light. By the time dawn crept through the small, grimy window, they had a loose plan. Ava would pretend to capitulate to her uncle, buying time while Elias quietly investigated his finances from the shadows. She would sell the ring to him in a public ceremony designed to look like a surrender. In the meantime, Elias would dig up the leverage they needed: old debts, hidden accounts, the skeletons Marcus had worked so hard to bury. 2 weeks, Ava said, rising from the chair. "I can hold him off for 2 weeks. After that, he'll be suspicious." 2 weeks, Elias agreed. "I'll have something by then." She paused at the door, her hand on the rusted handle. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the tea. For the rescue. For everything." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You might hate me when this is over. I'm not a nice man, Ava. I do what's necessary, not what's kind." She looked back at him, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like amusement. "I've been surrounded by nice men my whole life," she said. "They were the ones who let me down. I think I can handle a man who isn't nice." She slipped out of the room, and Elias was left alone with the phoenix ring glinting on his desk. He picked it up, feeling its weight in his palm. It was warm, as if it had absorbed the heat from her fingers. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he was about to step back into a world he had sworn to leave behind. And he knew, even more certainly, that Ava Sterling was the most dangerous person he'd ever met, not because she meant him harm, but because she made him want to care about something again. He was still staring at the ring when his burner phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was a photograph of Ava leaving his quarters, captured from a security camera. Below it, a message. "Interesting choice of company, Elias. Welcome back to the game." His blood ran cold. Someone had been watching. Someone knew who he was. And whoever they were, they had just made it very clear that the game was no longer his to choose. The war had found him, whether he wanted it or not. Ava Sterling walked out of the janitor's quarters with her spine straight and her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat. The service corridor was dim, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed with an ancient, tired buzz. She forced herself to move slowly, deliberately, as if she had simply taken a wrong turn on her way back to the penthouse. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to curl up in a corner and disappear. But she had learned, in the span of a single night, that running never solved anything. It only delayed the inevitable. She reached the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The door slid shut, and she allowed herself one ragged breath. Just one. Then she smoothed her robe, lifted her chin, and became Ava Sterling again. Her penthouse suite was bathed in the pale gray light of early dawn. She crossed to the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the city stir to life below. Somewhere out there, Elias Vance was already working. She had seen the shift in his eyes when he'd agreed to help her, a flicker of something old and dangerous, waking from a long hibernation. He had been a king once. She had seen it in the way he carried himself, even in those threadbare coveralls. The knowledge both thrilled and terrified her. She had just handed her family's most sacred symbol to a man she'd met 48 hours ago. A janitor. A disgraced CEO. A stranger. And yet, when she thought about it, she realized she had never trusted anyone more. Not her father, who had spent her entire life preparing her for a throne he'd always intended to keep. Not her mother, who had abandoned her without a backward glance. Not the string of boyfriends and suitors who had wanted her name, her money, her connections. Elias had asked for nothing. He had offered everything. That was the difference. That was why she had given him the ring. Her phone buzzed. It was her father's private line. She answered with a steady voice, the mask firmly in place. "Good morning, Father." "Ava," Victor Sterling said, his voice rougher than usual, a telltale sign of the pain he was trying to hide. "I need you at the office in an hour. The board has called an emergency meeting. Marcus is pushing for a vote of confidence." She felt a cold wave wash over her. He was moving faster than she'd anticipated. "What's his argument?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "He claims I'm too ill to lead," Victor said, a bitter laugh escaping him. "He's not wrong, but that's not the point. The point is he's trying to force a succession before I'm ready." "Before you're ready." "I can handle it," Ava said. "I can handle him." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I know you can," her father said finally. "That's what scares me. You're more like me than you realize, Ava. You've got the same fire, the same stubbornness, the same refusal to bend. It's a gift and a curse." "I'll take the curse," she said, "as long as it means I win." She dressed with surgical precision, a charcoal power suit, razor-sharp heels, her hair swept back in a severe bun. No jewelry except the small diamond studs her mother had left behind. She looked every inch the heiress, the successor, the future of Sterling Industries. But beneath the armor, her mind was racing. Elias had told her to play the long game, to appear weak and compliant while he worked his magic from the shadows. That meant she had to walk into that boardroom and let Marcus think he was winning. It went against every instinct she had. She wanted to scream, to fight, to tear his smug smile off his face with her bare hands. But Elias had been right about one thing. Trust was a luxury. And if she wanted to win, she had to earn it. The Sterling Tower loomed against the skyline, all glass and steel and cold ambition. Ava walked through the lobby with her head held high, ignoring the whispers that followed her. She had heard them all before. The heiress. The ice princess. The girl who inherited everything and earned nothing. They didn't know her. They didn't know the sleepless nights she'd spent studying financial reports, the hours of negotiation she'd sat through while her father tested her resolve, the way she'd learned to read a balance sheet before she'd learned to ride a bike. She had earned her place. And now, she was going to protect it. The boardroom was packed. 12 men and women in expensive suits, their faces a mixture of curiosity, greed, and barely concealed excitement. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled, his smile as greasy as ever. He looked like a cat who had just swallowed a canary. "Ava," he said, gesturing to an empty chair. "So good of you to join us. We were just discussing your father's health. Such a tragedy." She sat down, folding her hands neatly on the table. "My father is fine," she said, her voice silken. "He's taking a brief respite, but he'll be back in the saddle within the week. I'm here to represent his interests in the meantime." Marcus's smile flickered. "His interests? Or yours?" She met his gaze without flinching. "They're the same thing, Uncle. They always have been." There was a murmur around the table. She could feel the sharks circling, sensing weakness. But she gave them none. The meeting dragged on for hours. Marcus presented a series of motions designed to strip her of power, to transfer authority to a committee he controlled. She objected, politely and firmly, while carefully yielding just enough ground to seem reasonable. By the end, she had agreed to a limited audit of her father's recent decisions, a move she knew Marcus would use to dig up dirt, but she had secured a 6-week moratorium on any further changes to the board structure. It was a compromise. It was also a trap. Elias would have approved. Afterward, Marcus cornered her in the hallway. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said, his voice low and venomous. "But you're still just a little girl playing at being a CEO. You don't know the half of what's coming." "Then why don't you tell me?" she asked, tilting her head. "Since you're so eager to share." He leaned in, his breath sour with coffee and arrogance. "Because I've got the entire board in my pocket. Because your father's medical records are already in the hands of the press, ready to go if you step out of line. Because you've got nothing to fight me with, Ava. Nothing." She smiled, a cold, bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're wrong about one thing, Uncle. I've got everything to fight you with. You just don't know it yet." She walked away, her heart racing, but her face impassive. She had bluffed. She had bluffed spectacularly, and Marcus had bought it. But the bluff wouldn't hold forever. She needed leverage. She needed Elias. That night, she slipped out of her penthouse and met him in a grimy diner across town. He was already there, nursing a cup of black coffee, his coveralls replaced by a nondescript jacket and jeans. He looked different in civilian clothes, still tired, still watchful, but somehow more substantial. More real. "What did you find?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from him. "More than I expected," he said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Your uncle is in debt to some very bad people. Eastern European syndicate. They've been laundering money through a shell company that traces back to one of his subsidiaries. He's not just greedy, Ava. He's desperate. And desperate men make mistakes." She opened the folder, scanning the documents. Bank statements. Wire transfers. Photographs of Marcus meeting with men who looked like they'd just stepped out of a crime thriller. "This is enough to destroy him," she breathed. "This is enough to put him in prison." "It's enough to give you leverage," Elias corrected. "But it's not enough to stop him. If you release this information, he'll retaliate. He'll leak your father's medical records, and the stock will crash regardless. You'll both lose." She looked up at him, frustration burning in her chest. "Then what do I do? What's the point of all this if I can't use it?" He held her gaze, his eyes unreadable. "The point is you have options now. You have a weapon. You don't have to fire it. You just have to make sure he knows you have it. Make him believe you're willing to burn everything down. He'll back off. It won't be a permanent solution, but it'll buy you time." "Time for what?" she demanded. "Time to build your own army," he said quietly. "Time to become strong enough that no one can threaten you ever again." She stared at him, the weight of his words settling over her like a mantle. He was right. He was absolutely right. She had been so focused on surviving the next day that she'd forgotten to plan for the next decade. "I need you to teach me," she said. "Everything. How to read people, how to anticipate their moves, how to build a network of allies who aren't just waiting to stab me in the back." He studied her for a long moment. "That's not something you can learn in a few weeks. It takes years." "Then give me years," she said. "I'm not asking for a quick fix. I'm asking for a foundation. Something that can't be taken away from me." He leaned back in the booth, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know," he said slowly, "I haven't had a student in a long time. I'm not sure I'm any good at it."
"Try me," she said.
"I'm a fast learner." He laughed, a soft, rusty sound, like a door opening after a long winter. "All right, Ava Sterling. Let's see what you're made of." They spent the next hour mapping out a strategy. She would pretend to play along with Marcus, giving him just enough rope to hang himself. Elias would continue digging into the syndicate's operations, looking for a way to sever Marcus's ties to them without triggering a bloodbath. And Ava would start learning, not just business strategy but the art of war. She would learn how to read body language, how to lie convincingly, how to turn her enemy's strengths into weaknesses. It was a crash course in survival, and she was ready for every brutal lesson. As she stood to leave, Elias reached out and caught her wrist. His grip was firm but gentle. "One more thing," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your mother." I looked into her too. She froze. "Why?" Because she's been watching you, he said. She's been watching you for years, Ava. She's the one who sent the photograph of your uncle's meeting with the syndicate. She's been feeding me information for weeks. She never abandoned you. She was protecting you. Ava's world tilted. All those years of bitterness, of grief, of feeling unwanted and unloved. All of it was wrong. Her mother hadn't left. Her mother had been fighting for her from the shadows, just like Elias was now. Where is she? Ava demanded, her voice cracking. Can I see her? Not yet, he said, releasing her wrist. She wants to meet you when you're ready, when you're strong enough to handle the truth. She said to tell you she's proud of you. She always has been. Ava stood in the middle of the diner, tears streaming down her face, and felt something shift deep inside her. The ice princess was melting, and from the ruins, something new was beginning to emerge. She had an ally. She had a teacher. She had a mother who had loved her all along. And she had a war to win. The phoenix was rising. And when it took flight, the world would burn or bow. Ava Sterling did not sleep that night. She sat in the darkness of her penthouse, the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows like scattered embers, and she replayed Elias's words over and over again. Her mother had been watching her. Her mother had been protecting her. For 15 years, Ava had nursed a wound so deep she thought it would never heal, a festering grief wrapped in anger and silence. She had built her entire identity around being abandoned, around being the girl whose mother had walked out and never looked back. And now, in the span of a single conversation, that foundation had been ripped out from under her. She was raw, exposed, and furious. Furious at her mother for not telling her. Furious at her father for letting the lies stand. Furious at herself for believing it so completely. She paced the length of her living room, her bare feet silent against the cold marble floor. The sterling seal was gone, sitting in Elias's pocket or wherever he kept it safe. She felt its absence like a missing tooth, a phantom weight on her finger. But she had traded it for something far more valuable. The truth. The truth about her mother, the truth about her uncle, the truth about the war she was already fighting. She had walked into that boardroom pretending to be weak, and it had worked. Marcus had bought the act. But now she knew that her mother had been pulling strings from the shadows, feeding Elias information, setting the stage for a confrontation that had been years in the making. The thought made her chest ache. At dawn, she called Elias. I want to see her, she said, her voice flat and hard. I don't care if I'm ready. I don't care if it's dangerous. I want to see my mother. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. She said you'd ask. Elias replied, his tone careful. She said to tell you it's not safe. Marcus has people watching your movements. If you go to her, you'll lead him right to her doorstep. Then I'll be careful, Ava said. I've been careful my whole life. I'm done with careful. Another pause. Meet me at the diner in 2 hours, Elias said finally. I'll take you to her. But you have to listen to everything I say, Ava.
No deviations. No heroics.
If I tell you to run, you run. I understand, she said. I promise. The diner was quiet when she arrived, the breakfast rush still an hour away. Elias was already in the back booth, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He looked more tired than the night before, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. He had been working all night, she realized. Working for her. The guilt hit her like a physical blow, but she pushed it aside. There was no room for guilt. Only action. We're going to a safe house, Elias said, sliding out of the booth. It's in the industrial district. She's been staying there for the last 2 years, ever since she learned about Marcus's dealings. She's been building a case against him, piece by piece. Why didn't she just come to me? Ava asked, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. Why did she make me think she didn't care? Elias looked at her, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. Because she knew that if she reached out, Marcus would use her to hurt you. She made herself a target, so you wouldn't have to be one. She's been fighting for you, Ava. She just couldn't let you know she was fighting. They drove in silence through the gray streets, the city slowly waking around them. Ava watched the buildings shift from glittering towers to crumbling warehouses, the landscape growing grittier with every block. The safe house was a nondescript brick building wedged between a shuttered factory and a scrapyard. It looked abandoned, which was probably the point. Elias parked the car around the corner and led her through a maze of alleys and fire escapes until they reached a rusted steel door. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A moment later, the door swung open, and Ava came face to face with her mother. Eleanor Sterling had aged. The elegant, composed woman of Ava's childhood was gone, replaced by someone thinner, grayer, with deep lines etched around her mouth and eyes. But her gaze was the same, sharp, intelligent, and fiercely protective. She looked at her daughter like she was seeing a ghost. "Ava," she breathed. "My baby." And then she was pulling her inside, wrapping her in an embrace so tight that Ava felt her ribs ache. It was overwhelming, the scent of her mother's perfume, the feel of her hands in Ava's hair, the muffled sob that escaped her throat. For a moment, Ava was 7 years old again, terrified and alone, and her mother was the only safe place in the world. Then the anger surged back, hot and bitter. "You left me," Ava said, pulling away. "You left me, and you never said goodbye. You let me believe you didn't love me." Eleanor's face crumpled. "I know," she whispered. "I know, and I will never forgive myself for it. But I did it to protect you. Marcus was already moving against your father. He threatened to hurt you if I didn't leave. He said he'd make your life a living hell. I had to choose, Ava. I chose your safety over my own happiness." Ava stared at her mother, the pieces clicking into place. All those years of absence, all those missed birthdays and holidays and school plays, they were neglect. They were sacrifice. "He threatened me?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "He threatened to hurt me when I was 7 years old," Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He said he would make it look like an accident. He had people, Ava.
He still has people."
"I ran so that you could live." Ava felt the rage shift, redirecting itself toward a new target. Her uncle had terrorized her mother into leaving. He had stolen 15 years of their relationship. And now he was trying to take her company too. "I'm going to destroy him," Ava said, her voice cold as steel. "I'm going to take everything he loves and burn it to the ground." Eleanor reached out and cupped her daughter's face. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." They spent the next 2 hours in the tiny, cluttered apartment, surrounded by stacks of files and photographs. Eleanor had built a comprehensive case against Marcus, documenting his connections to the syndicate, his money laundering schemes, his attempted bribes, and his threats. She had even recorded several conversations, using a device she'd hidden in a pen. "This is enough to put him away for life," Ava said, leafing through the evidence. "Why haven't you released it?" Eleanor shook her head. "Because the syndicate has people in the justice system. If I go public, they'll bury the evidence or kill the witnesses. I've been waiting for the right moment. For the right ally." She looked at Elias, who had been standing silently by the door. "You brought me the cavalry," she said, a hint of wry amusement in her voice. "Though I never expected the cavalry to look like a janitor." Elias shrugged. "I've been called worse." Ava looked from her mother to Elias, a sudden, fierce hope blazing in her chest. She had 2 people she could trust. 2 people who had risked everything to help her. It wasn't an army, but it was a start. "We need a new plan," she said, sitting down at the cluttered table. "Marcus thinks he's winning. He thinks I'm weak and desperate. We need to use that against him." Elias nodded. "We let him make the first move. He'll be expecting resistance. When he doesn't get it, he'll get overconfident. That's when we strike." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "I've been waiting 15 years for this moment. Tell me what to do." They worked through the morning, sketching out a strategy that would lure Marcus into a trap. Ava would continue playing the helpless heiress, giving Marcus enough rope to hang himself. Elias would use his old contacts to gather intelligence on the syndicate's operations, looking for a weakness they could exploit. And Eleanor would stay hidden, continuing to build the case that would eventually bring everything crashing down around Marcus's ears. By the time they finished, it was almost noon. Ava felt a strange lightness in her chest, a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. She was no longer alone. She had an ally, a teacher, and a mother who had loved her all along. As she stood to leave, Eleanor caught her hand. "Stay safe," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't lose you again." Ava squeezed her mother's fingers.
You won't, she said.
"I'm stronger than you think." "I know," Eleanor said, a smile breaking through her tears. "I've been watching you, Ava. I've seen you grow into something incredible. Your father may have given you the company, but you built yourself. And that's worth more than any empire." Ava left the safe house with Elias, her mind spinning with plans and possibilities. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting a pale, watery light over the industrial district. She felt like she was seeing the world for the first time, the colors brighter, the edges sharper. She was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. She was a queen, and she was ready to move her pieces. "Thank you," she said to Elias as they walked back to the car. "For everything. For bringing me here. For not giving up on me." "I'm not the one who should be thanked," he replied. "You're the one who walked into a janitor's quarters and asked for help. Most people would have been too proud." "Most people are idiots," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "I learned that a long time ago." They drove back into the city, the familiar skyline rising before them. Ava's phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "Excellent meeting today, niece. Let's have lunch next week. I'd love to discuss your father's future." She read the message and laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "He's so sure of himself. He has no idea what's coming." "Let him stay sure," Elias said. "Confidence is the enemy of caution. We'll use his arrogance against him." She nodded, a grim satisfaction settling over her.
2 weeks, she said.
2 weeks, and this is over. One way or another. But as they pulled into the parking garage of the Sterling Tower, her phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. This time, it was a photograph of her mother, taken through the window of the safe house. Below it, a message. "I know about your little reunion, Ava. Tell your mother she should have stayed gone. You have 48 hours to hand over the seal. Don't make me prove I'm serious." The blood drained from Ava's face. Marcus knew. He knew about the safe house. He knew about her mother. And he had just issued an ultimatum. She looked at Elias, her hands trembling. "He's found her," she whispered. "Marcus has found my mother." The war had just escalated, and Ava had just been dealt a devastating blow. Ava Sterling felt the world tilt sideways. Her mother's face on that screen, the cold threat beneath it, the clock ticking down her chest. It was all too much and not enough. She wanted to scream, to break something, to tear the city apart with her bare hands until she found Marcus and made him pay. Instead, she took a breath. One breath, then another. She looked at Elias, whose expression had gone dangerously still. "He doesn't know where she is now," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "That photograph was taken from a distance. He's trying to rattle you. If he knew her exact location, he wouldn't have sent a warning. He would have sent a body." It was brutal logic, but it was sound. Ava forced herself to think, to plan, to move past the paralyzing fear. "We have to move her," she said.
"Right now.
Somewhere he can't find." Elias was already reaching for his phone. "I'll make the arrangements. But we need to buy time. You need to give Marcus what he wants." "The ring," Ava said, her voice sharp. "I'm not giving him the ring. Not the real one," Elias said, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "But he doesn't need to know it's a fake." The plan came together in a blur of urgent whispers and frantic phone calls. Elias contacted an old associate, a jeweler who owed him a favor, and commissioned a replica of the sterling seal within hours. It was a masterful forgery, gold-plated and weighted to perfection. To the untrained eye, it was indistinguishable from the original. But Ava knew the truth. The real phoenix was still in Elias's pocket, waiting for the right moment to rise. The fake would be her offering, her sacrifice to the altar of her uncle's greed. She would hand it over in a public spectacle designed to make Marcus believe he had won. And while he celebrated, she would dismantle everything he had built. The exchange was set for midnight at the Sterling Tower's observation deck, a glass-walled perch that overlooked the city like a throne in the sky. Ava arrived alone, dressed in a simple black dress that was more armor than fashion. Her hair was loose, her face bare of makeup. She wanted Marcus to see her vulnerability, to believe that he had broken her. He was already there, waiting by the railing, his silhouette sharp against the glittering skyline. He turned as she approached, his smile wide and triumphant. "Ava, darling. I'm so glad you came to your senses." She stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her. "I've got what you want," she said, her voice flat. "But first, you're going to call off your people. No more threats against my mother. No more spying. You leave her alone, or this deal is off." Marcus laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "You're not in a position to make demands, niece. But I'll be generous. The moment that ring is in my hand, your mother becomes irrelevant to me. She can rot in her little hideaway for all I care." Ava pulled the replica from her pocket, holding it up so it caught the moonlight. It gleamed like a star, beautiful and deadly. "Take it," she said, tossing it to him. He caught it with a triumphant grin, holding it up to examine it. "The phoenix," he breathed. "Finally. All mine." "You can have the ring," Ava said, her voice hardening. "But you'll never have the legacy." The first domino fell at 1:07 a.m. Marcus's personal phone rang, a shrill sound that shattered the silence. He answered it, his expression shifting from triumph to confusion to raw, unbridled rage. "What do you mean? The accounts are frozen," he hissed into the receiver. "That's impossible." "I have authorizations." He listened for a moment, his face going pale. "All of them, every single one." Ava watched him, a cold smile curving her lips. She had spent the last 48 hours transferring her uncle's hidden assets into a secured trust, using the documentation her mother had painstakingly gathered. The syndicate's money was gone, rerouted through a series of shell companies Elias had set up during his CEO days. Marcus was broke. He just didn't know it yet. "You," he spat, turning to her with murder in his eyes. "You did this." "I did," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I've been doing it for weeks, Uncle. You were so focused on the seal that you forgot to watch your back. You forgot that the Sterling women are never as weak as you think they are." Marcus lunged at her, his fingers curling into claws. But before he could touch her, Elias stepped out of the shadows, his movement fluid and precise. He caught Marcus by the collar and slammed him against the glass railing, the impact shuddering through the entire structure. "You made a mistake," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "You thought she was alone. She never was." Marcus gasped, his eyes wide with shock. "You're the janitor," he wheezed. "I should have known. I should have. You should have stayed in your lane." Elias cut him off. "But you couldn't resist, could you? Greed is a hell of a drug." Ava stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "You threatened my mother. You tried to destroy my father. You thought you could take everything from me. But you forgot one thing, Uncle." She reached into his pocket and pulled out the replica ring, holding it up so he could see the imperfection, a tiny flaw in the engraving that marked it as a forgery. "The real phoenix is already in its rightful place, and you will never touch it again." The police arrived minutes later, responding to an anonymous tip that Elias had placed before the meeting. Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his face twisted with impotent fury. The syndicate's operatives were rounded up in a coordinated sweep across the city, their accounts frozen, their operations dismantled. It was over. Or, at least, the first battle was won. Ava stood on the observation deck, the wind whipping her hair around her face, and watched her uncle's car disappear into the night. She felt hollow and full all at once, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind a strange, peaceful exhaustion. "It's done," she said, turning to Elias. He nodded, his face unreadable. "The first chapter is done. The rest of the story is yours to write." "What about your story?" she asked. "What about your revenge against the people who took your company?" He looked at her, something shifting in his eyes. I've been thinking about that, he said slowly. I spent a year hating them, obsessing over what I'd lost. But standing here, watching you fight for everything you love, it made me realize something. What? That revenge isn't the same as justice, he said. I can spend the rest of my life trying to destroy them, or I can build something new. Something better. I think I'd rather build. Ava felt a smile tug at her lips. That's very wise for a janitor. He laughed, a genuine, warm sound that transformed his tired face. I'm not a janitor anymore. I quit. Last night. Then what are you going to do? I don't know yet, he admitted, but I've got a few ideas. She walked back into the tower, the golden light of the lobby washing over her. The staff was already buzzing with the news. Marcus Sterling had been arrested, his crimes exposed, his reign of terror ended. Ava was no longer the Ice Princess. She was the Phoenix, risen from the ashes of her own grief and pain. She had taken the hardest lessons of her life and forged them into something unbreakable. She had found allies in the most unlikely places. She had found her mother, and she had found herself. Later that night, she visited her father's bedside. Victor Sterling lay in the hospital room, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes were bright with pride. I heard what you did, he said, his voice weak but strong. You saved the company. You saved the family. You saved yourself. I had help, she said, sitting beside him. The janitor. You wouldn't believe me if I told you who he used to be. Victor smiled, a knowing glint in his eye. Elias Vance, I've known about him for weeks. Your mother told me when she reached out. Ava stared at him, stunned. You knew. All this time, I knew there was someone working in the shadows, her father said. I didn't know if I could trust him, but I trusted you. And you made the right choice. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the life still pulsing through him. You're going to get better, she said. I won't let you leave me yet. I'm not going anywhere, he said, squeezing her fingers. I've got a front row seat to the show. The next morning, Ava stood on the balcony of the Grand Horizon Hotel, the same balcony where she'd first met Elias. She was dressed in a sleek white suit, her hair pulled back in a sophisticated updo, the phoenix seal gleaming on her finger. The city lay before her, vast and full of possibility. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Elias, dressed in a bespoke suit that fit him like a second skin. He looked like the king he'd once been, a quiet power radiating from him. The board meeting is in an hour, she said. Are you ready? I'm always ready, he replied, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. And I've got something for you. He handed her a small velvet box. She opened it to find a delicate bracelet, a slender silver chain with a single charm, a tiny phoenix, wings spread, mid-flight. It's not much, he said, but it's a reminder. You're not alone anymore. She fastened it around her wrist, the cool metal settling against her skin. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. You don't have to thank me, he replied. You did the hard part. You believed in yourself when no one else did. She looked out at the city, her city, and felt a surge of determination. What's next? She asked. What do we do now? He smiled, a slow, confident smile that made her heart skip.
We build, he said.
We build something that can't be taken away. And we never stop fighting. She nodded, her gaze steady, her future bright. Together, she asked. Together, he agreed. And as the sun rose over the glass towers of the city, Ava Sterling turned from the balcony and walked into her destiny. The phoenix had risen. The war was just beginning. But she was no longer fighting alone.